The Great Depression was a time of tremendous upheaval in the United States. It brought about lasting change that affects us to the present. Up until 1929, when this story begins, the Republicans had maintained dominance politically since the Civil War. But the rise of a Democrat during this period, and his particular policies to combat the Great Depression, began a steady change in the political parties that would take the rest of the 20th century to complete. The Democrats would go from the party of the Solid South, opposition to Republican dominance, and the most conservative party, to being the party of urban centers throughout the U.S., liberalism, and progressivism. In fact, this was basically a new form of liberalism, often called social liberalism. Social liberalism today is a bit different than what it was back then, but the Great Depression started it. For economic ideology often predates cultural ideology. So it took the Democrats turning left economically before they would turn left socially. And all of this was caused by the Great Depression, but there's a lot of debate over what caused the Great Depression itself. Generally, there's two schools of thought. There's the Keynesian and monetarists. John Maynard Keynes put the blame for the Depression on shrinking spending habits, that essentially people had less money to spend and therefore economic collapse. This led him to argue that governments during depressions should use deficit spending, as in social welfare programs and that, to help stimulate the economy and foster more spending, as in economic growth. This was the favored view of how the economy worked during the Depression. But a new school called the Chicago School argues that the Depression was caused by deflation, as the credit system became overextended, which means that the monetary system itself collapsed. And their answer to a depression is to shore up bank reserves, making sure that banks can't collapse because they don't have enough money in reserve. In either case, this all centers around how a depression grew from a stock market crash, which came about on the 29th of October, 1929. This is known as Black Tuesday, but there were actually several events that led up to Black Tuesday. First, throughout the 1920s, a series of Republican presidents and Congresses stepped back regulation that had grown during the progressive era of the early 20th century. They had essentially brought back laissez-faire capitalism. And so they believed that there would be unlimited growth during the Roaring Twenties. But the US was part of a global system that proved that assumption wrong. The US and British stock markets were fairly interlinked, and it turned out that a British financial group under the command of Clarence Hatry had been manipulating the market, which was illegal there. And so Hatry was jailed for his financial fraud, leading the London stock market to crash. Their crash would eventually ripple over to the New York Stock Exchange, which crashed a month later. But what made the US crash particularly bad was that there was a series of overinvestments that made the entire US financial system unreliable. First and foremost was the fact that agriculture was overproducing at the time. The US was simply producing too much of a crop and meat yield, leading to a bubble from all the excess yield. Investors were also using too much credit to continue investing as the stock market continued to grow. The 1920s were boom years, and people figured as much credit as they could take, they would be able to make that back and pay off that credit, since they believed that the market would just continue to grow. This is called leveraging, as in buying stocks on credit by leveraging your current wealth to gain more wealth. Another significant problem with the U.S. financial system was that investment and checking banks were interconnected, as in people who had checking accounts at a bank might have that excess funds that are just sitting in their bank invested in the stock market, since it was essentially just cash lying around inside of a bank. So they'd just go and invest that in stocks so that the bank might make more money. Plus, the growth of U.S. industry during the Second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th and early 20th century meant that there was tons of different things to invest in. And while there had been a depression in 1920, it was clearly a result of World War I, so everyone thought that they were safe in just continuing to invest more and more and more, regardless of these structural issues, because they didn't expect a crash to come, which, of course, came in October of 1929. But this was what the Federal Reserve was created for, was to stop these kinds of depressions. It hadn't worked in 1920, but that was because a tariff had actually worked pretty well. So the Federal Reserve kind of backed off again, refusing to bail out a number of banks that failed during the crash. They also raised interest rates, which led to a shrinking money supply. With all this happening, people started to crowd banks and start demanding their money, but since it was invested in the stock market, they couldn't withdraw their money, leading to a bunch of bank failures. And since the Federal Reserve was not bailing out those banks, this led to a cascade effect. But there's still a question of whether or not this would spread to the wider economy. The stock market is not the economy itself. The stock market is merely where people trade stocks in various companies. While it sometimes can be an indicator of the economy, it is not the economy. And for the remainder of 1929, despite these bank failures and major corporate stocks losing their worth, American industry continued to flourish. In fact, in 1929, very few corporations were even traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and there were a number of stock exchanges throughout the US, some of which would not even collapse until the 1930s. But with all these bank failures, there's a question as to how people would gain credit in order to stimulate the economy by spending. So debts ballooned, and people weren't spending very much, thereby not stimulating the economy. So whether or not it was because of a lack of money or because of a lack of spending, this stock crash was inevitably going to slip into a depression. But it took some time. The Herbert Hoover administration chose to initially wait and see what the heck was going to go on. He figured that initially state and local governments would respond to any depression setting in. The one thing he initially did was to transfer the burden of maintaining the gold standard by which currency was valued to other countries, basically meaning that if somebody wanted to call for their dollar's worth of gold, that would be transferred to another country's gold supply. This did nothing, as the US steadily slid into depression. So the first thing that the Hoover administration did to try to combat the oncoming depression was to do the same thing that had worked in 1921, namely to pass a higher tariff. By extracting more wealth from imported goods, the US federal government could pass relief programs. But the problem was, the world was setting into a Great Depression as well, and so this actually hurt international trade, basically spreading the depression from the US to the rest of the world. And even though raising the tariff had worked in 1921, the failure of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 has forever doomed such relief measures. But Hoover didn't stop trying to end this depression with just a raising of a tariff. The tariff was supposed to be just the first part of a relief program. So Congress first acted by passing the Muscle-Shoals Bill, which attempted to create a water authority that would be a signature bill as part of the New Deal that would come years later. But Hoover vetoed it. He instead organized the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief in 1931. This was a voluntary organization that encouraged companies to hire people through a lot of government publicity. It gave no incentives to increase employment other than that publicity. And so he passed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932. Now, this Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, was actually an outgrowth of a voluntary organization called the National Credit Corporation of 1931. And basically what the RFC did was fund state and local efforts with federal cash. This led to the Emergency Relief and Construction Act of 1932. Get used to all of these abbreviations because there's just a ton of them coming up. But the ERCA allowed the RFC to fund public works. The signature one of these works was the Hoover Dam. Herbert Hoover was an engineer by trade, and he had actually worked on the engineering required to create a dam on the Colorado River near Las Vegas, Nevada. Though the project wouldn't actually start until 1933, this was Hoover's pet project. Though the following administration would try to rename it to the Boulder Dam. One, the dam isn't in Boulder Canyon, it's in Black Canyon, so they got the name wrong there anyways. And two, that was purely because everyone thought that Hoover had done too little to save the economy. As you can see pictured here, this is what became known as a Hooverville, a derogatory name for these kinds of makeshift camps that would show up all over the place as people were unemployed and couldn't afford their homes, so they would set up these kinds of camps. And they blamed Hoover for the Depression, hence why they called them Hoovervilles. And throughout the 1930s, unemployment would be terrible. As you can see in this chart, it really wasn't until World War II in 1941 that the US saw a significant decline in unemployment. This was truly the worst economic depression in U.S. history. But what really turned people against the Hoover administration was his handling of veterans. In 1932, which was an election year, veterans marched on Washington, D.C. Prior to the Depression, they had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I. That bonus was passed in 1924, called the World War Adjusted Compensation Act. Though that bill had been vetoed by President Coolidge, it was overridden and made into law, but it did say that veterans would not get their bonus until 1948. As in, they would not get their bonus until 30 years after their service in 1918. So as the Depression ramped up, in 1931, veterans campaigned for an early release of that bonus as a kind of stimulus check. And veterans organizations kind of differed on this. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, or the VFW, supported the early release of bonuses, while the American Legion thought it would hurt the economy and therefore opposed it. So veterans ended up organizing their own protest. The name the U.S. Army gave to troops sent to World War I was the American Expeditionary Force. So in 1932, veterans campaigning for early release called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. 40,000 veterans marched on Washington, D.C., setting up Hoovervilles all over the city. This was essentially the first major Occupy protest in American history. All they did was set up camps and carry signs around Washington, D.C. They were allowed to gather for about a month or so, but on the 28th of July, 1932, Herbert Hoover declared that it was an insurrection, though there had been literally no fighting whatsoever. And this was clearly a peaceful protest. The U.S. Army was sent to disperse its own veterans. They coordinated with local police and put everyone under the command of General MacArthur. Even a young George S. Patton violated orders to bring tanks in to send them down Pennsylvania Avenue against veterans. The local police ended up killing 2 veterans in the process of this, and numerous of them were injured by the use of poison gas. This is a bit different from tear gas like today. This stuff would cause violent vomiting and temporary blindness. So given all of that, you can guess that there was a bit of national outrage over what Hoover had done to American veterans. They would not get their bonus, but Hoover lost the election that year. A couple years later, another bonus army was organized, and this time they were more peaceably dispersed by offering government jobs to the veterans. And eventually in 1936, the government would pass the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act, which redeemed bonuses in 1937, although the new president did try to veto it again. But in either case, how Hoover handled this so-called insurrection led to an election sweep by the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As you can see, very few states voted for Hoover, because crushing the bonus army was abhorrent to nearly everyone. And FDR came in promising a New Deal. Much like his cousin's Square Deal from the early 20th century, FDR's New Deal tried to push 3 R's, which were relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy back to normal levels, and reform of the financial system overall to prevent a repeat of this depression. Essentially, he was going to try to do that Keynesian deficit spending. So the first 100 days of FDR's presidency were quite a wild ride. There was the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. And the NRA pushed for codes of fair competition. Companies could voluntarily become NRA members, but once they did so, they had to abide by those codes of fair competition. So this set prices for members and required them to have NRA badges displayed in their corporate offices and whatnot, basically creating an impetus for other corporations to join the NRA. The act also created the Public Works Administration, which was basically just a continuation of Herbert Hoover's Emergency Relief and Construction Act. Basically, the PWA sponsored major public works, such as the Hoover Dam. Then came the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and FERA gave loans to states for their own relief programs, very much like Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So this was essentially federal aid to state and local governments, which also allowed for state and local governments to start pushing their own civil works, which FERA had a Civil Works Administration built into it. the CWA helped fund those small public works. In order to get workers for all of these different projects, the FDR administration created the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the CCC often supplied the workforce for all of these public work projects. For instance, many highways were paved by the CCC. Told you all that the letters are going to get crazy. Another new organization was the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA was essentially that Muscle Shoals bill that Hoover had vetoed. It allowed for a bunch of dams and waterworks to be built throughout the Tennessee Valley, and the TVA held control over those public works. It was a huge success. Then there was the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. The AAA levied new taxes on farm processors, as in the people who actually process the grain and meat and all that other stuff. These taxes paid for the government to buy up excess livestock. Remember all the overproduction stuff we were talking about. So essentially, this acted as a subsidy to farmers, which allowed them to fallow lands that might have been overproduced otherwise. The Federal Farm Board, which was created by the Hoover administration, was lumped in to control all of this spending. As you can already tell, there's a lot of acronyms when it comes to the New Deal, and it's actually going to get worse. But even within the first 100 days, you can already see that FDR was trying to fulfill those 3 R's, as in relief, recovery, and reform. But one other thing that FDR did in his first 100 days was to pass the 3-2 Law, also known as the Cullen-Harrison Act, which tried to stimulate the U.S. economy by allowing the sale of beer that contained 3.2% alcohol or lower. This was still during Prohibition, and FDR clearly wanted to end Prohibition and thereby stimulate the U.S. economy. All of this stuff that was passed in the first 100 days was just the starting point, especially the sale of beer. FDR put the entirety of Prohibition on the chopping block with probably my favorite constitutional amendment, the 21st. It had actually passed during the Hoover administration, but that 3.2% beer law pushed the ratification forward, which finally got fully ratified on December 5th, 1933, allowing for 1934 to be the first year without prohibition. So that was one attempt to kickstart the economy, but a reform that came with the New Deal was the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment and loan banking. It also created bank holidays, essentially days in which banks were not allowed to be open. So by separating investment and checking banking, Glass-Steagall effectively made it so that banks could no longer be affected by bank runs during a crash. On top of this, the act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which backed private bank loans with federal insurance. That way, the credit crisis of 1929 could no longer happen, since it was now within the FDIC's purview to back those loans. Another reform that was passed during the early years of the FDR administration was the end of the gold standard. Now, U.S. currency did not become fully fiat, as in not backed by anything. It did have ties to the gold standard. But what changed was that average U.S. citizens were no longer able to exchange their dollars for its value in gold, and vice versa. Instead, gold was only being used for international exchanges, which essentially stopped people from stockpiling gold and thereby losing the economic impetus of all of that spending. Then there was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, which at first only required that corporations that engaged in interstate commerce had to disclose how much commerce they were engaging in. But a few months later, Congress passed the Securities Exchange Act, which allowed the SEC to regulate all financial trading, which it continues to do so today. The Federal Housing Administration was created to set building standards and mortgage regulations throughout the entire country, especially any corporation that was engaging in interstate commerce. An adjacent creation to the Federal Housing Administration was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which had the federal government insuring home loans. And finally, there was the creation of the Economy Act, which cut federal workers' salaries across the nation. All of this from the stuff from the first 100 days, and these acts from 1933 and 34, was the signature legislation of the first New Deal. But the first New Deal quickly came under attack from both sides. You had progressives who were saying that this wasn't enough to deal with the enormity of the situation, and you had conservatives saying that this was too much power for the federal government to wield. Conservatives especially like to say that this wasn't reforming capitalism or anything, it was actually implementing socialism. It became such a common accusation that Roosevelt, during one of his fireside chats, where he would get on the radio and speak to the nation as a whole, said on June 28, 1934, "A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, sometimes communism, sometimes regimentation, sometimes socialism. But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical." But it's not as though the accusation of socialism was completely unjust. Until FDR's administration, the Soviet Union remained unrecognized by the United States. But FDR formally recognized the USSR in 1934, allowing for diplomatic relations to be normalized. And the USSR had been doing something fairly similar to the New Deal since 1929, called 5-year plans, where the Stalinist regime would set a batch of agenda goals for the entirety of the Soviet Union to achieve in 5 years. Many of these plans did similar things to the New Deal. As one rock band said later on in the century, 5-year plans and New Deals were wrapped in golden chains. The Soviet Union also pushed for what they called a popular front through their Communist International, or Comintern. And what the Popular Front was essentially communist countries being willing to work with capitalist countries in order to fight against the rise of fascism. So they encouraged coalition building between communists and capitalists. But the New Deal also held a lot of similarities to the opposite side of the political spectrum, namely fascism. Though fascism had already existed in Europe since the 1920s, in Germany, the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty, or simply Nazi Party, came to power the same year as FDR. And while the New Deal certainly didn't duplicate the more pernicious policies of the Nazi Party, Nazis did engage in tremendous deficit spending, creating massive public works, corporate subsidies, and privatization through command relationships. Of course, one of the biggest differences in terms of those massive public works was that Germany was rearming, while the United States throughout this period maintained a very small standing military. But in either case, people mistakenly associate socialism of the far left with National Socialism, or Nazism, of the far right. So as FDR formed his New Deal coalition, bringing together the liberals of both parties, conservatives revolted, creating their own conservative coalition which would last well into the 1960s. They opposed what they saw was big government and the tyranny of the New Deal. Because of this conservative coalition, the Democrats and the Republicans began to realign along who was loyal to the New Deal or opposed it. The conservative coalition formed what is often called the Old Right, and eventually were made up of pretty much mostly Republicans, as opposed to the New Deal coalition, who were of course made up of mostly Democrats. New Dealers would remain in power for another 40 years, turning the Republican Party further and further conservative as New Dealers became what were called social liberals. And even though the old right constantly complained of the New Deal's supposed socialism, often mistakenly conflating it with fascism, most historians today like to call the New Deal a form of reform capitalism, as in a move away from laissez-faire capitalism to a more regulated market. But politics were not the only challenge to the New Deal. There were constitutional problems with it as well, which came to a head with several Supreme Court cases during 1935. Prior to that, the court had actually been largely sympathetic to the New Deal. For instance, they said in Nebbia v. New York, "Thus has this court from the early days affirmed that the power to promote the general welfare is inherent in government. The Fifth Amendment in the field of federal activity, and the 14th, as respects to state action, do not prohibit the governmental regulation for the public welfare." But on May 27, 1935, on what is often called Black Monday, the Supreme Court ruled on 3 separate cases that deemed many parts of the New Deal unconstitutional. Humphrey's Executor v. United States ruled, the President may not remove any appointee to an independent regulatory agency except for reasons Congress has provided by law, which thereby stops the President from appointing a bunch of people to the Federal Trade Commission. Louisville Joint Stock Bank v. Radford made it so that the U.S. couldn't restrict banks from repossessing farms. And finally, Schechter v. U.S. ruled that the National Recovery Administration was fundamentally unconstitutional because of its price setting, which is a fundamental part of its legislation. That was the premier piece of the first New Deal. And the Supreme Court wasn't done yet. Less than a year later, in United States v. Butler, ruled that the Agricultural Adjustment Act's taxing method was unconstitutional, though that was quickly amended in 1938. So understandably, with all these pieces of Roosevelt's New Deal being taken away by the Supreme Court, FDR wanted to fundamentally change the court in his favor. And so he sponsored the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937. Essentially, it would have appointed secondary justices to fill in for old ones and encourage older justices to retire. This was essentially trying to pack the court with favorable justices. But in the Senate, this bill went nowhere as it got held up in committee and couldn't go anywhere when its biggest proponent died suddenly. So the first deal was on its last legs. And during the run-up to the 1936 election, the New Deal saw a challenge from the left. Throughout 1935, a Southerner named Huey Long campaigned for what he called every man a king, which was essentially extreme wealth redistribution. He saw Roosevelt's New Deal as too conservative. This campaign to share our wealth, or every man his own king, started to really pick up steam throughout 1935. Long was a senator from Louisiana, and he used his pulpit to constantly campaign for this wealth redistribution plan. Seeing how much opposition was created simply by labels of socialism upon the New Deal, the opposition to Long became violent, and he was assassinated in September of 1935. Though his wife would take up his position in the Senate, this assassination essentially silenced the Share Our Wealth campaign. But these challenges to the New Deal were somewhat overridden by concerns over a disaster happening on the Great Plains that would help reinvent the New Deal into its second iteration. It's known as the Dust Bowl. As you can see pictured, this was quite a devastating time. This is an event known as Black Sunday, which happened on April 14th, 1935. The Great Plains had turned to dust, and these monumental storms would whip up the topsoil that had eroded away, coating everything in dust, and causing seemingly apocalyptic conditions. The dust was so bad that at times, static electricity would literally arc in front of people. And this is a problem that had deeper roots than merely the Great Depression. The Homestead Act had steadily increased its acreage for each farmstead, increasing the amount of agricultural land taken under the plow. And then throughout the early 20th century, farmers began to use more and more industrialized methods, such as heavy tractors, insecticides, and chemically treated fertilizer. This meant that people could bring even more soil under the plow. And once the Great Depression hit, farmers were no longer able to get loans as easily, and so many of them ended up having to abandon their farms, causing a rapid onset erosion of the topsoil. By 1934, the Dust Bowl had set in, and there would be dust storms throughout the rest of the 30s. These conditions tended to focus on the southern part of the Great Plains, like the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, and even a bunch of Kansas and Colorado. As conditions worsened, it made living on the southern Great Plains basically impossible. Some of these dust storms would travel for hundreds of miles, even reaching Washington, D.C. at one point. Beginning in 1934, the New Deal sponsored planting a bunch of trees in rows to act as windbreaks throughout the Great Plains. By 1942, they had managed to plant 220 million trees, stretching more than 18,000 miles in a 100-mile-wide zone of trees ranging from Canada all the way to the Brazos River. This windbreak was instrumental in stopping the topsoil erosion that had caused the Dust Bowl. But in the meantime, people had to leave. thousands of migrants started moving from places like Oklahoma, often to California, where these people would work as farmhands. For instance, pictured is a woman named Florence Owens Thompson, who was working as a beet harvester in the shadow of an abandoned adobe in Nipomo, California. And this picture was taken for the Library of Congress and became rather famous later, though according to one of her children who is in this picture, she said, "For Mama and us, the photo had always been a bit of a curse." Thompson was not consulted and remained destitute while the Library of Congress used her image to promote the New Deal. Part and parcel with all of this was how migrant Mexican laborers were suddenly viewed unfavorably because they afforded competition to all of these Okies, as they're called. So in order to make room for Okie laborers, FDR sponsored a program of deportation for Mexican migrants. But that migrant mother photograph did its job and promoted the creation of a second New Deal. The first of these new agencies was the Works Progress Administration. Formed in 1935, they took over the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, and the WPA funded national arts and brought numerous agencies under it, including the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Public Works Administration. This also ended up taking over for a lot of state and local programs. Another piece of legislation that year was the Social Security Act. This took payroll taxes to give retirement benefits to the elderly, as well as provide insurance against unemployment. The retirement money part of it is still a national program today. Another premier piece of legislation was the creation of the National Labor Relations Board. It took over for a previous board that was designed to help negotiate labor disputes, but the NLRB basically became its own judicial body, through which recognized labor unions could seek aid, as well as starting investigations. But mainly they had the power to arbitrate labor disputes. And while the NLRB was created in 1935, the biggest change came from the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This mandated throughout the U.S. that there would be an 8-hour workday, with time and a half paid for overtime, a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, and guaranteed unemployment benefits. It was also the final nail in the coffin of child labor in the United States, which had steadily been regulated out of existence since the previous Roosevelt administration. There was also the creation of the U.S. Housing Authority, which subsidizes local housing agencies to help low-income people get housing, though it's been heavily reorganized under the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, with much of its funding gutted alongside. To pay for all of these change, there was a bunch of new taxes. FDR graduated the income tax, thereby making it so that if people make over a certain amount of money, they have to pay more of a percentage of that. FDR had already raised the top marginal tax rate to above 60%, but this new one almost hit 80%. At the peak of World War II, it would be above 90%. Along with more taxes on the rich, the US also started taxing corporate income. Since a corporation is technically a legal individual in the eyes of the law, its income not being taxed was quite an open loophole. Then there was the estate tax, which basically taxes the wealth that somebody inherits. And for estates that were above a certain dollar amount, they were taxed at 70%, meaning rich people could only inherit 30% of their parents' wealth. And finally, there was the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, or FICA, which paid for Social Security through a payroll tax. And finally, to bring it all the way back to all the people moving around, there was the Federal Resettlement Administration. The RA gave small loans to people moving, as well as the Farm Security Administration, which eventually replaced the RA and tried to promote better living standards throughout the US, including electrifying homes. But there was a dark side to the New Deal. Most prominently, with all of this resettling and federally backed home loans, the US government could decide what was a good area and a bad area for a home loan. And so they would draw maps throughout cities, listing what was the good area for loans and what was the bad area for loans. The worst areas were highlighted in red, which gave the term redlining. And people who lived in those redlined areas would have trouble getting home loans because of this federally backed discrimination. And of course, the people making those red lines typically highlighted areas that were low-income housing, especially where minorities lived. Black people would have trouble getting home loans, and thereby not being able to create generational wealth, which harmed black families for generations to come. FDR was a Democrat after all, and Southern Democrats were heavily invested in the white supremacist system of Jim Crow. Keeping and maintaining that was high on their list of priorities, and so it ended up affecting the FDR administration, which was best exemplified by his nomination of Hugo Black to the Supreme Court in 1937. Black happened to be an actual Klansman, and since Supreme Court justices have a lifetime appointment, he would serve until 1971, making civil rights decisions particularly difficult. If FDR did not push this racist agenda, the Solid South might have revolted against him, and so racism often creeped into the New Deal. At the National Crime Conference in 1934, they refused to recognize lynching as a crime, and the National Labor Relations Board adopted a policy of last hired, first fired, as in, when layoffs came, the last person who was hired would be fired, who were often minorities. So while the New Deal has lasting effects such as Social Security, an 8-hour workday, public works, and the reformulation of our entire economy, it also has a legacy of deepening poverty for those the system chose to discriminate against. But by 1941, the New Deal had seen a modicum of success. Unemployment was steadily lowering, and we've never had a depression of this sort again. But historians still argue over whether or not the New Deal was a success. It tried to fix the economy with the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. It gave a modicum of relief, barely any recovery, and was fully successful with reform. So it depends on which of those R's you think is more important. If it's reform, then it was a magnificent success. If it was relief, it somewhat worked. But if it was recovery, it failed. But as a song would later say, we replaced Dr. New Deal with Dr. Win the War, for what truly brought the U.S. out of the Depression was World War II.